My name is Philip Landrigan. I'm a pediatrician. As Mr. Sweeney just said, I'm Dean for Global Health, Professor and Chairman of the Department of Preventive Medicine, Professor of Pediatrics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. I've been involved since I worked in the 1970s at the Centers for Disease Control in tracking down the effects of toxic chemicals on children's health. And I'm happy to be here before you today to talk about brominated flame retardants. So I want to talk first about the distribution of brominated flame retardants in the environment. These chemicals, as you've already said, have become very widespread in the modern environment, used in furniture, electronic equipment, automobile materials, building materials. They're persistent in the environment, and when they get into people by inhalation, by ingestion through the skin, they're extremely persistent in the human body. They can last for years, even for decades in the human body. There have been some studies, and in my testimony I've included a graph. There have been studies that compare women in North America, mainly the U.S., versus women in Northern Europe, looking at levels of brominated flame retardants in breast milk. And you'll see when you look at the graph that the levels in the American women are greatly higher, several orders of magnitude higher than the levels in Europe, and continuing to go up. That reflects differences in the legislation in Europe versus the U.S. Let me talk about brominated flame retardants in children. Children are uniquely vulnerable to toxic chemicals, to brominated flame retardants and to toxic chemicals across the board. And that sensitivity is absolutely the greatest in the 9 months of pregnancy, when the child in the mother's womb is going through the extraordinarily complex, highly precise, highly choreographed stages of early development. Take the brain, for example. The human brain starts out in about the second to third week of pregnancy. There's a strip of cells along the back of the embryo lined up from north to south where the spine is eventually going to be. And over the next few weeks, those cells form a tube, which is going to be the spinal column. And then the cells at the head end, the brain cells, divide, they multiply, they move, they establish very precise connections between one another so that they can communicate. All of that has to proceed on a very exact schedule. If anything gets into the developing brain, lead, brominated flame retardants, organophosphate pesticides, phthalates, that disrupts the timing of early development, the effects can be devastating, because if the developing brain doesn't have the chance to form connections in the proper sequence, those connections are never formed, and the injury that results is permanent and it's irreversible. For centuries, it's been taught in toxicology that the dose makes the poison, which is a simple way of saying that the greater the exposure, the more severe, the more frequent the effect. And that proposition is certainly true most of the time, but it does not apply in early development, because in early human development, we've come to appreciate in the past 10 to 15 years that there are what are called windows of vulnerability, precise times in pregnancy when one or another organ in the human body is forming, and if the developing embryo or the fetus is exposed to a toxic chemical at the wrong moment during one of those windows of vulnerability, damage can result of a sort that has no counterpart whatsoever in adult life. A classic example dating back to the 1950s and 1960s was a global epidemic of birth defects that was caused by a chemical called thalidomide. Thalidomide was a medication developed in Europe. Doctors prescribed it to pregnant women because it turned out to be very effective in suppressing morning sickness during the first trimester of pregnancy. But unfortunately, between 10 and 15,000 of the women who took this medication in the first trimester gave birth to babies who were missing their arms and legs. And the mothers were physically unaffected. This speaks to the fact that there were enormous differences in vulnerability between the mother and her baby. And we've since repeated that experience, and for chemical after chemical after chemical, lead, methyl mercury, phthalates, brominated flame retardants, organophosphate pesticides, methylmercury, we found that minute doses of exposure in early life, levels that would probably be completely safe for an adult, are not at all safe for the developing human. And that's why I get very wary when people talk about thresholds or safety cutoffs. They may apply to us adults, but they, for the most part, in my experience, don't apply at all to the most vulnerable members of our society. So let's talk specifically about brominated flame retardants. They've been linked to multiple health effects: undescended testes, alterations in growth, endocrine disruption. I want to talk particularly about the brain injury that is caused by prenatal exposure to these compounds. Exposure of the embryo and the fetus in the womb to brominated flame retardants has been shown to result, a few years later, when you can properly assess the children, in increased rates of hyperactivity, anxiety, decreased performance in learning and memory tests. There were studies conducted right here in New York City by my crosstown colleagues at Columbia University, Dr. Julie Herbstman, Dr. Ricky Pereira at Columbia, published several years ago in the peer-reviewed journal Environmental Health Perspectives, and they found that children in this city with elevated levels of flame retardants in their umbilical cord blood at the time of birth, when these children were at the age of 6 and could be properly tested, they had delayed psychomotor development, they had delayed mental development, they had reductions in their verbal IQ, their performance IQ, and their full-scale IQ. There are also animal studies which produce parallel findings. So how do we go forward with this? I think the basic medical problem we have here is that the human brain has very little capacity to repair itself once it's injured. Therefore, the only rational way to deal with brain injury that's caused by a toxic chemical like brominated flame retardants is to keep the exposure to the toxin from occurring in the first place. Anything else is after the fact. It's too little, too late. I want to reiterate something that I've already touched upon, which is that legislation can strongly influence patterns of exposure to brominated flame retardants across a population. In the state of California, where Technical Bulletin 117 has held sway for many decades, California children have the highest levels of brominated flame retardants in their bodies of kids in any state in this nation because of that particular requirement. And by contrast, I've already mentioned the European example, that levels of these compounds in the bodies of Europeans are much lower than ours. So going forward, I think several things that the New York State legislature should do and maybe set a good example for the federal government. One is to pass and strictly enforce legislation that bans all use and sale of brominated flame retardants in New York State, all brominated flame retardants. I understand full well, I've had plenty of chemistry, that there are distinctions between these compounds, but they're all brominated flame retardants. None of them has been shown to be safe by any reasonable standard, and I think an across-the-board ban is the safest and cleanest way to proceed. Secondly, for the products that are currently on the market, it's necessary to mandate labeling that currently indicates the presence of brominated flame retardants in those products. It would be good if the legislature were able to provide support for research that would develop safer alternatives, although I consider that a lower priority because it's probably more in the federal purview. And finally, it would be good to support public education campaigns that educate the residents of New York State about the hazards of brominated flame retardants. Finally, I want to offer a comment on the whole question that you've just been debating over the last few minutes with the gentleman from the American Chemistry Council. There's endless debate about how much evidence is sufficient evidence to take a product off the market. I was doing public health at CDC in the 1970s. I was very actively involved in the debates that raged at that time at EPA about whether or not to take lead out of gasoline and lead out of paint in this country and out of some other products. And in that period of time, the industry was saying we can't take action, it would be rash to take action because we have to wait until a sufficient body of evidence accumulates to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that lead was not damaging children's brains. In other words, the position was the brains should be given the same consideration as that chemicals should be given the same consideration as a criminal defendant, innocent until proven guilty beyond any shadow of a doubt. And so the debate went on for years and years. Each year, many more tens of thousands of children were exposed to lead. Many more children were damaged. So I would urge you to bear in mind that not taking action carries its own costs. Does taking action have costs? Probably. But inaction also has costs, and that cost falls upon the most vulnerable people in our society. And I want to close by pointing out the extraordinary success that we achieved when we finally mustered the courage in 1976 to get lead out of gasoline. We reduced the incidence of lead poisoning by 95%. We brought about a 95% reduction in blood lead levels in American children. Across the whole population, IQ scores increased by between 2 points and 5 points across a whole generation of children. The kids are brighter than we are. And lastly, the economists have calculated that that has yielded an economic benefit in each annual crop of babies born since about 1980 of $200 billion in each crop of children. And the reason for that is that IQ points are worth money. The arithmetic goes like this: 4 million babies a year, say about 4 IQ points on average per child. Multiply that by $10,000 per IQ point over a lifetime. And if you just multiply those three numbers by each other, you get a number close to $200 billion a year in savings, which is an aggregate savings over the past 2 decades of a couple of $1 trillion. It's amazing what public health can do, the success that can result from banning a chemical. I think it's always easy for an industry to talk about the costs of pollution control because those costs are here and now and they're easily monetized. The costs of pollution prevention are much more difficult to calculate. They're spread across populations. They're spread across years and across decades. Discounting factors kick in, more assumptions kick in. But when you can line up the economists and do the studies, the study after study that we've seen undertaken in recent years has shown enormous benefits from taking public health action that bans toxic chemicals that damage children's brains. So I'll close with that. Thank you again for having invited me before you, and I'm pleased to take your questions.